If anybody attended one of the SRA's roadshows in the run-up to outcomes-focused regulation, I'm just going to remind you what was promised to the profession during those roadshows. Mark's made the point again this morning. You were promised more freedom and flexibility. Freedom to innovate and be creative. The move away from prescriptive rules-based regulation was intended to release entrepreneurial energy into our marketplace. So I'm going to really consider today whether that's happened, the extent to which that has happened or not happened. We were also promised a new approach to enforcement, a less combative, more constructive approach, proportionate enforcement. Because the number of, or the nature of, the number of rules was reduced, it was said that there would be fewer boxes for you to tick, so that the burden of compliance on your firm would reduce. You wouldn't have to tick hundreds of boxes to make sure that you were complying with hundreds of rules. You would just have to achieve compliance with some broad principles and some fairly straightforward outcomes. So I'm going to consider whether or not compliance has become easier. It was also promised that you would enjoy a stable regulatory environment, that you would know that the 10 mandatory principles were fundamental, that they were not going to change, and therefore you could plan ahead, you could make plans 5-10 years in advance and know that the regulatory goalposts were not going to change. It was said that the principles would abide, and therefore you'd enjoy this stability. The cost of regulation, we were told, would also come down as the SRA adopted a smarter approach to regulation. There's been lots of innovation within the SRA in the way that you regulate it, things like the establishment of Mark's department. So they were the things that were sort of promised to you, and I just want to try and share with you some of the benefit of our experience of working with primarily small to medium-sized law firms day in, day out, all around the country. We've moved from this idea of rules-based regulation to this concept of principle-based regulation. So I'm just going to remind you what that means, and I've given a very straightforward example of a rule, which is that you must not drive faster than 30 miles an hour. It's a clear, bright line. You can't cross it. You know exactly where you stand. You don't have to make any judgments. So there are certain benefits to rules. There's also a downside. That's very prescriptive and curtailing sort of rule. There may be occasions when it's perfectly safe to drive at 40 miles an hour, but you still can't because the rule says you've got to drive at 30 miles an hour. If you look at the principle, on the other hand, it is ambiguous and it is open to interpretation, and you do have to make a judgment. You have to look at the weather conditions, the state of your car, the traffic on the road, etc. But on the plus side, it's flexible. It gives you that flexibility. When it is safe to drive at 40, you can. But there may equally be occasions where it's not safe to drive at 30, and you may have to drive at 20. You have to make those judgments. With the rule, there is no interpretive risk. And what I mean by interpretive risk is simply this. It's the risk that you make a judgment in good faith and having carried out all of your due diligence and in good conscience, and then retrospectively, your regulatory body looks at that judgment and disagrees with you. That's what I mean by interpretive risk. And with principle-based regulation, there is a high degree, it's inherent in the model of interpretive risk. The simple risk that even though you made the decision in good conscience, the SRA disagrees with it. So we have then the increased possibility of arbitrary sanction, the increased possibility of retrospective sanction, and we have uncertainty and the kind of fear and the worry that goes along with uncertainty. So I've described this as a new regulatory bargain. It's a new deal. You get more freedom, and that's great, and that's to be welcomed, but you also have to live with uncertainty. Whether or not it's a fair bargain, whether or not it's a bargain that you wanted, it's the bargain that you were promised. It's the bargain that you were sold. And I want to see, really primarily today, I want to consider whether or not that new freedom has materialized. Because if you don't feel more free today than you did a year ago, if you're not enjoying more freedom now to be innovative and to do new things, then this hasn't worked, or it hasn't worked for you. The legal profession has a very strong and established interpretive community. What I mean by that is a range of bodies and individuals who are interpreting the code with varying degrees of authority, power and influence, and issuing very precise guidance on how you should interpret those principles and apply them to your firm. The danger, I think, is that we may be heading back towards a very prescriptive system of regulation, which is kind of sneaking in through the back door because of the precise interpretations that are being placed upon the principles by this interpretive community. If that doesn't make sense, hopefully it will in a moment. I'm going to give you some examples. The Law Society has issued 1, 2, 3, 4, I don't know, maybe 20 practice notes on outcomes-focused regulation in the last year. There's a list of them. Many of those practice notes run to dozens of pages. Are you free to completely ignore them and enjoy your new freedom? Are you free to say, well, it's just a Law Society practice note, it's not binding upon me? Well, yes, you do have that freedom. Although Law Society practice notes are regularly cited by the SRA during disciplinary action, it's quite a risky thing just to say, you know, the Chancery Lane have issued 20 practice notes, but I'm going to ignore them all because I want to enjoy my new freedom. The Law Society also issues a legal compliance bulletin. You have to pay for it. It contains detailed, often prescriptive, guidance on how you should interpret the principle. The Law Society also provides a risk and compliance service where you're given support and advice and guidance, again, as to how the Law Society thinks you ought to be interpreting those principles. The question I'm asking is any of this stuff diminishing the freedom that you were promised? The Law Society has now published 15 books in total on outcomes-focused regulation. There's an example there for 60 quid. You can buy a Colp's toolkit. And notice that that toolkit's quite comprehensive. You get a CD with it. It contains a lot of compliance documents, which you just load up on your computer system and use for your firm. Is that freedom? If you take that approach, if the whole profession starts to take that approach, are we really seeing freedom? Are we seeing innovation and creativity? Or are we all just doing the same thing? Lexile have also upgraded, the Law Society have also upgraded the Lexile standard to version 5, which primarily has been done to achieve some consistency with OFR. So again, if you're a Lexile accredited firm or want to be, you're not always free to interpret the principles how you wish to. You have to interpret the principles in the way that the Lexile office prescribes in the standard. The SRA itself issues loads of guidance. There's an example, Mark's referred to it already. Outcomes-focused regulation at a glance. It's 8,500 words, so I'm not sure whether that's a glance. But, you know, what is the status of that document? Are you free to ignore it? And for that matter, are you free to ignore Mark's slides from today? I mean, what is the status of that sort of guidance which comes out of the SRA? And, that, you know, there's lots of it. The legal ombudsman's doing the same thing. Just have a look on the website and you'll see an awful lot of guidance there. To what extent are you free to ignore that? What about authoritative texts? They've all been updated and upgraded. There's a new issue of Cordery on legal services out. Again, telling you the opinion of the commentators as to how you should interpret those principles. And what about people like me? LBS Legal, you know, we advise several hundred law firms. We advise on how they should interpret those principles. Since the introduction of outcomes-focused regulation, our turnover's increased by 700%. Our headcount's increased by 400%. We have a new office. That's all very nice for me. I'm not going to complain about it, but perhaps you should be. Perhaps some people in the room should be complaining about the fact that a lot of the profession is now carrying this sort of overhead. Technology-driven solutions, here's just an example, a software product known as Reliance, developed by some guys in Manchester. And the Law Society have now taken a stake in this compliance software. This is a complete solution to your compliance needs. This is how it's marketed. And I've looked at the system, I've had a very good look at it. It is extremely prescriptive. It leaves you very little freedom at all. So if you decide, as many people will, to play safe and to take this Law Society-owned product and to implement it within your firm, what impact does that have upon the freedom that was handed to you by the SRA a year ago? There's lots of other toolkits around. There are also lots of other compliance consultancy businesses around, I should probably say, but I'm not going to tell you about them. Here's an example. This is another toolkit produced by Lexile. You know, very, very credible. It's been put together by some very good lawyers. Some of these products, these toolkits or software products, you know, some will emerge as dominant over time. Some will be used by the majority of the profession. It's still a competitive. We're still in the competitive stage at the moment, but 2 or 3, I suspect, will emerge victorious, and I expect to see a lot of the profession dealing with compliance in exactly the same way as everybody else, not in their own innovative way and not enjoying this freedom. So has the promised freedom materialized? Are you more free now than you were this time last year or not? Is the momentum towards greater freedom and flexibility, or are compliance systems becoming increasingly homogenized? My point is this: you do have to live with the uncertainty and the risk. You have to live with the downside of the deal, this increased possibility of arbitrary sanction, retrospective sanction, regulator ambush. If you're not enjoying the freedom, if you're not taking advantage of it, and if the whole profession is not taking advantage of it, then the deal was a bad one for us. I'll just give you a quick illustration from Newcastle. This was a firm who were interested in setting up a joint venture company with some independent financial advisors. It was an entirely legitimate joint venture, and they sought advice from us in the first instance as to whether this new business would be compliant. And this was under the old 2007 rules initially. I said, yes, it would be compliant. They said, what about in October? And I said, well, here are the principles. This is what I think. You make your own mind up. And they said, come on, Chris, that's nowhere near good enough. We're about to invest £1 million into this business. We need some clarity. We need some certainty. And I said, well, the new model of regulation doesn't really enable me to give you what you want. They then went off to a city firm to get a second opinion. They got the same opinion as they got from me. And at that point, 3 out of the 4 partners said, okay, we've got 2 professional opinions. They both say that what we're doing is compliant. That's good enough for me. Let's go ahead. But one partner said, it's not good enough for me. My practice certificate's at risk. My house is at risk. I'm not prepared to take this gamble. I need some clarity. I need some certainty. She was a very risk-averse lady, and that was her position. Now, because of that, things started to get difficult within the firm because she wouldn't agree to do this joint venture. So the joint venture was off. It collapsed. And just take note that that was exactly the type of innovation that this model of regulation is intended to encourage. And in that instance, it actually prevented the innovation from ever taking place. There's been subsequent fallout because, of course, one partner in particular was desperate to do this deal. He was very upset that he couldn't get this deal done. He's now left the firm. She's now left the firm because she thinks that they were all mad for wanting to do this. So they're down to 2 partners. They've lost lots of clients. Other assistant solicitors have followed the 2 partners who's left. It's been very, very damaging to the practice. It's just an example of the kind of irony which is attached to principle-based regulation, which is that those things which it is intended to encourage, it sometimes has the opposite effect. It sometimes prevents those things from ever happening. That's what we're seeing within the profession. A certain amount of shoaling together for safety, running to the same sort of compliance software packages, adopting the same systems, taking the cautious approach, not innovating, not all doing things differently in a way which is right for your business, your practice area, your clients, but all doing the same thing. And that's my anxiety, that's the direction of travel that we're in. So, whether or not we're going to really enjoy this freedom or are enjoying this freedom, I think is highly questionable. Are we enjoying a stable regulatory environment? Well, I intend just to answer that in about 3 seconds by saying that in less than a year, the SRA handbook is now in version 5. So if you're a person responsible for compliance within your practice, you've had on 5 occasions in the last year to get your head around a new SRA handbook. It's 600 pages long. It's not an insignificant document. So I don't think we are particularly enjoying a stable regulatory environment. I don't think it really does empower that sort of planning in the way that we were promised. Are you enjoying low-cost regulation? I mean, it's not really for me to say. The SRA does publish, in fairness, the SRA publishes an awful lot of financial information, and it's all on the SRA's website. And if you take an interest in these things, you'll see that almost every aspect of the SRA's budget has increased ahead of inflation consistently for the last 3 years, and continues to be the case. And at the height of the deepest and the longest recession since the war, I do take issue with the fact that the SRA decided to move to these rather modest offices in prime real estate area in Birmingham. That's, I think, is a Jasper Conran restaurant on the top floor. I don't know whether you have lunch there, Mark. Or...
Not yet, no.
The reality, in my view, is this. Prescriptive guidance is being issued, will continue to be issued, and it has diminished and will continue to diminish any new freedom that you were promised. And in my view, that freedom has already disappeared to vanishing point. The guidance is very extensive. It comes from a huge variety of sources. Keeping on top of it is difficult. Finding it is difficult. Collating it all is difficult. Working out what it all means for your practice is difficult. This is an overhead. This is an extra burden. I don't agree with Mark's view that outcomes-focused regulation increases your overheads. I believe that it does increase your overheads. Interpretive risk is leading to cautious and conservative behaviour. There's a higher than ever degree of homogenisation of compliance systems. The fear of retrospective and arbitrary sanction is stifling legitimate entrepreneurialism. Compliance systems, particularly at smaller firms, are overloaded, and the regulatory environment is unstable and costly. And I do, incidentally, agree with Frank Marr's view that if you're a solicitor in England and Wales, you're probably the most heavily regulated person in the world, as the racing driver guy says. Confidence in the SRA's competence has been badly knocked. The experience with the My SRA website has been extremely poor and frustrating and very damaging to some firms. I haven't got time to sort of tell you all of the horror stories that I could do. Practicing certificate renewals in 2011, you're all aware of the fiasco that took place then. And I do think that there should have been a high-level resignation within the SRA when you've got 130,000 solicitors practicing without practicing certificates. It's a pretty fundamental mess-up. Telephone lines, I don't know how often you all call the SRA or what kind of, how pleasurable you find the experience. I call them a lot, and I don't find it very pleasurable at all, and often you can't get through. Waiting for 40 minutes is not unusual. The delays to ABS authorizations are driving people who aren't used to our profession absolutely nuts. Every time there's a new entrant to the profession, keep an eye on the press releases, and every time a new ABS is authorized, you'll see a press release, and it'll always say the same thing, that this almost didn't happen because the SRA took so long and was so incompetent in the way that it handled the process. I question the wisdom of deciding, at a time like this when so many small firms are under such pressure and finding life so difficult, I do question the wisdom of saying we're going to choose this time to run a series of diversity swoops where we come and check you know, that your equality and diversity procedures and policies are up to scratch. You know, I've got nothing against equality and diversity, but there's a wise time and a right time.
I don't know whether I'm writing. I read a sort of postscript to the headline about diversity swoop, saying actually it's a sort of pilot with engagement with firm before they arrive. So I think the word swoop.
The word swoop was the Law Society's word, and the SRA have challenged it. Yeah.
So I think perhaps swoop is perhaps
it's.
We never swoop.
Perhaps rather more dramatic than the fact.
Thematic visit, then, let's call it that. Even, you know, even if it is a thematic visit, I question the wisdom of having them now. Compliance is more costly and time-consuming than ever, in my view. How do you live with outcomes-focused regulation? How do you live with this increased uncertainty and risk? Well, I think the profession is taking broadly the right approach. I think it's right to swarm. I think there is safety in numbers. I think there is uncertainty and unacceptable risk inherent in this model. It can destroy your business and your livelihood and your professional status overnight if you get it wrong. I think some of the movement that's happening, although it defeats the freedom that you're intended to be given, I'd rather be safe in my business than extremely free. I think firms have to do things like obtain Lexile and CQS so that they can demonstrate to the people in Mark's department that they are taking compliance seriously. I think that firms have to just accept that this is a new and it's an ongoing overhead, and have to bite the bullet and make the fairly modest investments which are required now in order to keep your firm safe in the long run. The dangerous thing is just to ignore all of this and get left behind. Firms should have a plan. Compliance is now an area of expertise. You need to have that expertise in-house. You either have to learn it, or you have to hire it in, or you have to outsource it to somebody else, or you have to insure against certain elements of the risk, or you have to invest in technology-based solutions, or rely upon these sort of toolkits or suites of documents that are being provided, or a combination of all of those things. But I think as long as you've got a credible plan and you stick to it and attend to this and make sure that you don't get left behind, and stay in the shoal, that would be my advice, and it may sound slightly cynical, but that is my sort of view.